Welcome, and I apologize for the sound in the next room. I have nothing to do with it. That's not going to help.
I could go next door if you want.
Why don't you go next door and tell them there's a group here? God bless him. He's a great libertarian.
They got to do what they got to do. I hope he comes back with it.
It's my great pleasure to introduce Philip Kranefuss. Did I pronounce that correctly?
You did, yes.
That's incredible. Given the nature of my last name, which is so simple, Schnellvar. Yeah, people butcher that every day.
Kranefuss. Yep.
Kranefuss. Okay.
Very German.
And Philip's going to be talking about blockchain and libertarianism. And this is a subject that is dear to my heart. It's about new technology and how new technology can affect the world and affect government and affect all sorts of things. And with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Philip.
Thank you very much. Thank you guys. Again, my name is Philip Kranefuss. Can you guys hear me okay?
What?
Well, so first off, just thank you for having me. I'm flattered to be here, to be speaking to you guys. I think this is a really exciting subject matter. My goal here is to really make this easily to understand the concepts and get the grasp of what we're talking about. And with that framework in place, then we can start to talk about how some of these technologies are really going to impact potentially our lives, society, culture, moving forward. So very excited to talk about this. I've been talking about blockchain, especially in regard to real estate for a long time. The subject matter has always just gotten a lot of interest, whether people are already strongly interested in technology or have a strong understanding with that, or even just for people that this is brand new and what the heck, I've heard of Bitcoin and something called blockchain and what is all this stuff and where's it going? So excited to jump into that with you guys here. If we can go to the next slide, Ralph.
Let's hope I can get this to work. Oh no, not again.
And if not, it's okay. I can go without the other slides.
Yeah.
All right, fantastic.
You are a techie.
All right, so before we jump into it, let me give you just a bit of my background, give you a sense of where I'm coming from with all these technologies and this content. So first off, I'd consider myself an entrepreneur. Most recently, over the past 5 years or so, I founded a real estate brokerage firm. We got up to speed pretty well. We did a couple million in business the last couple of years and was fortunate enough actually to have just sold the company as of a couple of weeks ago. So you're looking at a free man, you're looking at somebody that's wide open at the moment, and I'm enjoying the moment to take a break and catch my breath. And one of the things I'm really passionate about is technology, talking about technology, especially where it meets society and culture, and so getting a chance to have do more engagements like these. So again, I'm an entrepreneur. I founded SPX Realty. I'm also considered a subject matter expert when it comes to blockchain and real estate. I've kind of made that my business. When you're a business owner, especially in the world of real estate where we're seeing a lot of technology, a lot of innovation, a lot of new things coming into the business that could really drastically affect what our futures are going to look like. From that standpoint, it was certainly my business to make sure I have my arms wrapped around new emerging technologies, especially technologies like blockchain and e-currencies, especially to understand those from the standpoint of how could they affect things and making sure that if there is going to be significant change, that we can see that coming, take whatever measures necessary, and hopefully be on the good end of those change processes as opposed to being a victim of technology and change and innovation. So that's one part. I do have somewhat of a unique background. People have called me a polymath in the past, and I guess maybe to some extent that does fit. I was a student of history. That was really my passion for a long time. In fact, I was planning to be a professor of history and make that my life focus. Somewhere along the way, I got into race cars and into motorsports. So for about 8 years or so, I was in North Carolina, and we started several different racing businesses, sold some of those, and really enjoyed the ride. So racing was a great vehicle, just as far as in the realm that within which we operated, we had a deliverable essentially every week. And so you really learn the art of execution, the art of getting things done, what really brings results as opposed to what doesn't. And I think in a lot of ways, the history outlook, to be able to understand situations, look at things, combined with that focus on successful execution, has really given me a firm background as far as being an entrepreneur and something that's looking to build and create. I did spend some time in IT services, especially focused around software development services for a few years prior to jumping into real estate. That was in between motorsports and the latest venture. And then I think that also gave me a really solid grounding as far as the role of technology. And again, especially as it relates to this presentation, I'm not really going to get in the nitty gritty, as far as the really detailed tech aspects. This is much more from a broad brush standpoint to make sure that you guys have a firm grounding in this, and that way we can really understand, where society, where culture, where personal liberties meet these technologies. So that's what we'll be jumping into. Can you guys hear me okay? Is this good? Would you like me to stand up? Would that be better? 6 and 1, half a dozen?
I want you to be comfortable.
Okay. All right, perfect. So let me just touch real quick before we go to the next slide on my history background. I think that really does inform a lot of my thinking. I did have somebody say to me just actually a few weeks ago, why would anybody study history? It just seems so silly to study the past when it's in the past and already behind us. And, frankly, that just struck me as very, very short-sighted. I think the benefit of studying history is it teaches you to objectively, look at situations, scenarios, understand them for what they are, right? And those same eyes that we're taking to look at the past, those are the same eyes that we take to, it's that same type of assessment as far as looking at the present. And now when you've got those two data points, really a firm understanding of what is, in the past, how did that lead us to where we are now, it gives you the beginning of that sweep of history to be able to make some assumptions as far as where we're going. And that's going to be a lot of the focus here with this presentation. What are these technologies? Where do they come from? Really understanding them for what they are. Talking about how they're starting to impact our society and culture currently in the moment. And with that, I think we can start to draw some assumptions as to where this is going to push out and exactly how that may have an impact on our lives in the future. So that kind of history, sort of sweep of history aspect is really kind of the underlying structure framework for this presentation. Before I move on, I'm okay with questions. I don't mind when my classes, my presentations are a little bit more lively. There's a little bit of back and forth. So if you guys have some questions, feel free to raise your hands. I may have a point to finish before I call on you. I'd also request that if there is a bit of back and forth or dialogue, that maybe the side conversations, those types of aspects, don't start to happen. We just kind of remain focused on the subject at hand. But, I want this to be a little bit more interactive than just a kind of me talking at you. Mm-hmm. I like a little bit of back and forth. And especially as we're really embarking on trying to understand some of these technologies that, the concepts aren't that easy to grasp. My job really is to make it a little bit more attainable, but I think within that scope, it's natural that there may be some questions that people have on their minds. So let's go to the next slide, Ralph.
Please work. Nope. Damn. Oh, God.
While we're waiting,
There it is. There it is.
I did just want to mention that as older I get, the more my observation is that history may not repeat itself, but it does seem to rhyme really well.
You're
Indeed.
quoting somebody. Who are you quoting? Mark Twain or someone?
Who am I quoting?
Well, I think Mark Twain did say that, although I was taught somewhere if you've got a, kind of a handy, catchy quote and you're not sure where to attribute it to, you just mention Mark Twain or something like that.
Or H.L. Mencken.
Yeah, exactly. You got a few, cast of characters there. But yeah, and to me that history again, it's that's where understanding comes from. So it's not just that history rhymes or repeats. I'm definitely more of the school that it does rhyme, but what we're looking to pick up is those patterns, those trends, right? Because those will repeat. And once we understand what that is, of course, as society and time progresses, things always take a different shape, but it's really a firm understanding of those patterns and how they're going to play out. And we're going to be getting to some of that here. So appreciate that comment. So as far as scope, first part I'm going to do is let's just make sure we're talking a common language here. We're on the same page as far as the definition of and the history of blockchain technologies, right? So we've got that same ground floor. We can talk about some of the aspects that are happening as far as how these technologies are permeating our lives currently. And I think those two are going to give us a lot of context, hopefully allow you guys to really have your arms around that. And then we're going to step to that next stage, which is really talking about what's next, where this is going. And I think, again, with that groundwork, with all us being on the same page, it's going to be much easier to go along for that ride as far as where things are going. So that'll be the impact of technologies in relation to personal liberties. That'll be the last part of the presentation that we'll cover in detail. Ralph, do you feel comfortable trying the next slide?
Oh, pray. Nope, didn't work. God bless it. Unbelievable.
Nope. There we go.
It is.
Alrighty, so to talk about blockchain, I think we really need to talk about Bitcoin first, right? Is everybody here familiar with Bitcoin? At least
Yeah,
they've heard the
it
term?
talks about it here.
Okay,
I
perfect.
understand for one thing, is there really such a thing as a Bitcoin you can handle? Is it all on computers?
No, it's exactly.
All right.
Yep.
Okay.
There might be some
virtual.
tokens, right? Aren't there some tokens like that?
I mean, maybe somebody's crafting some and trying to sell them, and certainly there's a lot of different currencies now. But really, that token is essentially something that lives online.
Okay.
And especially as I'll jump into the blockchain technologies in just a minute, you'll see how all that kind of goes together. How the blockchain is almost like the virtual version of having that hard piece of currency. So the background with Bitcoin, I'm not going to spend too much time here, but does anybody know when it was founded?
1999?
2009.
2000.
It's a bit later. Does anybody know who founded Bitcoin?
We don't know.
Nobody knows.
It's a mystery.
Yeah.
Some Japanese guy, but they
Satoshi Nakamoto is attributed to be the creator. Satoshi Nakamoto is a real person. May or may not be the person that actually created Bitcoin. More than likely, it's probably not. In fact, it's probably a group of individuals, one of which, perhaps the ringleader of, actually happened to live just down the road from Satoshi Nakamoto. And when you understand, where Bitcoin really initially found its place, which a lot of that was on the dark web, these torrent sites, what have you, you can understand where perhaps the creators of this technology, of this encrypted currency, that they wouldn't, mind maybe staying anonymous to some extent. So hence they adopted this Namda technology, took a real person, in some ways as almost a straw man, I guess you could look at it, to be the figurehead for this and to obfuscate who was really at hand, behind the development of those technologies.
So how do we know it's not an NSA or CIA plot?
Well, we don't.
Thank you.
So that's the background. Is founded in 2009, and initially. It really, for me, I started following this about 2014, 2015. I just thought these were fascinating, technologies. But the valuations didn't increase that rapidly, that significantly, over that time frame. It was really in 2017 where there was so much hype around Bitcoin. Does anybody know what the valuation increase was from start of 2017 to finish?
Bob Berry here, who is a Bitcoin evangelist.
Gotcha.
And at that time, I believe a Bitcoin was around $300.
Okay.
And he was imploring us to get out there and buy.
So wise words. So, and especially when you look at 2017, there's a 1,300% increase from the start of 2017 to the finish of 2017. Right? So the valuation certainly did a whole lot to get this to be a very much a public talking points that attracted greater interest than maybe just those people that were really focused in the nitty gritty of the technology or currency evangelists, what have you. So that price increase was really quite significant and reached a high. I think it was like 17, 18K thereabouts. And now I think we're hovering about 9,600, 9,800 last time I checked. So that might be close to it. I think it was a couple of days ago that I looked. It might be off by a few thousand. That's how.
8,500 the last I looked.
Okay, yeah, and that's certainly when you look at those valuations and the fluctuations, it's quite volatile, right? So that's the background of some of the stuff why this is culturally relevant at this point. Now, when I talk about what is a cryptocurrency, and this is how we're going to start to roll in the blockchain aspect with this discussion, there's a few things that are really key. So the way that I would define like Bitcoin or cryptocurrency, it's a digital, decentralized, anonymous currency that lives completely online. So hence that digital component, it's just online only. This isn't backed by gold bars or even printed money. It's just within its own online framework, and that's really where the blockchain comes into play. So we'll touch on that, and let me just put that on a shelf for a second. We'll circle back around to that, right? So that's the digital component. Encrypted means it's anonymous. Pretty straightforward, So if you're holding a coin, it is very, very difficult, if not impossible, to tell, without announcing yourself, who is that coin holder? Who holds that money, right? And especially going back to when this was a way to partake maybe a little bit more efficiently as far as the commerce within these, dark web, torrent sites. That's a key component. But it's really the decentralized aspect. This means two things, but it's that decentralization that's really at the heart of what these currencies, especially the cryptocurrencies, represent. So decentralized means two things. The first part is it's not backed by a nation state. Again, it's not backed by any sort of gold standard or financial institution or what have you. This is really just a currency of framework that lives on its own. So from that standpoint, it's decentralized, and there isn't one point of sort of what's behind this. It's really just this framework, right? So that's one aspect. But the major point here, as far as the other part of decentralization, and again, this is a key component of blockchain, is that it's a different way to store the data, to store this value. So when you're holding a coin, right, typically when it comes to data, when it comes to online technology, when you're keeping information, there's usually one central place where they keep that information, a central database. I mean, it may not always be just one server, one set of servers, or even one physical location. Nowadays with the cloud, some of these things can be somewhat distributed. But mind you, as far as kind of like the type of database, it's just that. It's held in kind of, at least digitally, one central location. What's revolutionary about these technologies with the coin is that the way that the data is stored, instead of having it being this one sort of, centralized repository, it's distributed over a global network of computers. Right, so it's when you look at a centralized database from a hacking standpoint, they call that a honeypot. One place to go. And if you can hack into it, now you can wreak all sorts of havoc and do whatever you want to do. It's certainly something that we've had to live with over the years. You look at the major hacks of like Sony and some of these other financial institutions. Right, that was all because you've got this centralized database kind of framework. What makes this technology so much more secure in the way that you store the data, such a paradigm shift, is just that, being distributed over a global network of computers, and that is what the blockchain technology makes possible. Could we get to the next slide?
Yeah. Go ahead,
Sure.
Janice.
I understand how you've just said that being in one place is easier to hack, but I don't know much about hacking, but I've read in the papers about people who've done things that have affected millions of people's computers.
Yeah.
So why would this be safer? Why couldn't somebody go online and totally fuck up this whole Bitcoin trick?
And that's a great question. And in the next slide, we're going to start to get to the nitty-gritty of why this is, from a security standpoint, this type of blockchain component where you store this data over a global network of computers it just significantly raises the bar of what a hacker would have to accomplish in order to be able to, to get into a system, to wreak havoc, to achieve whatever means they wanted to.
Okay.
But what you're understanding too is, look at the way that the typical framework, all these computers are connected. Even with the blockchain, this global network of computers, that's really what it is. It's, they're all connected. It's just a different way of storing the data. But when it comes to the traditional, like let's take your Wells Fargo account or something like that, for example. Your user interface on your computer, when you're taking money out or transferring money, that's sending a call to that centralized database. Right? So if somebody wants to steal money or again, they've got whatever means they're trying to achieve, they can go into that database, that one centralized place, make that alteration, and it may not necessarily in that instance, to paraphrase what you're saying, fuck up your computer, but it may, they can then hack into your finances. Right? So all this information is kind of like stored in, imagine if this is like physical. We're all living in homes, and all of our information is somehow like in the town center, in this one physical spot. And so if somebody wants to get access or do something nefarious, that's where they're going to go. And that may affect our livelihoods, our own individual homes, because of what they're doing in that physical space.
Well, I understand the banks are taking advantage
of the blockchain.
Are you going to talk about that?
Yep, exactly. Yeah, and that's why it's just such a paradigm shift, really heightens the security aspect compared to the traditional. And that's why the blockchain is really so interesting, so compelling. So real quick, before I get further into really getting exactly to the blockchain, I want to make a couple of points further about these e-currencies. Right now, there's about 1,500 or so, and that was as of like a month or two when I last updated my content for this. Who knows how many different coins there are nowadays? Frankly, the currency world, let's make sure that these things are separate. The currency and the blockchain, those are two different things. Blockchain being the framework that makes these digital currencies, able to be in existence, right? But the currency world is like the Wild West right now. Some people are saying Bitcoin is going to be the coin moving forward, and that's going to be the dominant, e-currency or perhaps the dominant, world currency. I think that's a lofty step up to make that kind of statement. I think right now there's so many different coins coming to play. Certainly, and I'm not getting into the nitty gritty with this, but even Bitcoin has certain limitations that some of these newer coins are trying to take advantage of or improve upon. So with this realm of technology, with the volatility, with the low barrier to entry as far as creating a coin, it's really going to be very, very difficult to say who's going to be the winner, what's this going to look like years down the road. In fact, my assessment is, if anything, we're probably going to be in a multi-currency, and that includes the traditional, that includes strict e-currency, and probably hybrid sort of between the two.
A quick question, would they track the same valuation? What are they worth now, 8,000?
No, they all have...
Or are they competing in value? What's the market bear on this?
Well, it's funny because, and I'll try not to get too far down this tangent, but all these different coins have their own inherent values and their own little, currency marketplace, right? So you're going to see some differences with that. Are they in competition? Yeah, probably to some extent.
Yeah, because Amazon's going to take one, maybe not all of them. Like your big retailers, will they honor all the different Bitcoins coming down?
Well, and those are some of the challenges right now, just with the way that and some of these have to do with the limitations with the blockchain technologies. It's not the easiest right now as far as the day in, day out currency.
Because Amazon could create its own, right?
Certainly, and that's actually something we'll...
Anyway.
I don't know if this is too much detail, but actually Bitcoin is actually learning something from the competition and continues to evolve itself as well. So it's not a static currency at all. There continues to be what are called forks and additional ways that Bitcoin, they're trying to make it more useful based on what's happening with other cryptocurrencies.
You got it. Yeah, you got it. And even when you're talking about other currencies, there was some speculation that there's a currency called Tether, which this is, the valuation is tied directly to the US dollar. And what they're seeing was the way that people were trading within the Bitcoin space and then trading out into Tether as maybe a more secure, where you're not quite as subject to those, valuation fluctuations. that somehow tether this more stable kind of valuation coin was actually propping up Bitcoin to some extent. Some people made the case that Bitcoin might only be worth a third of what it is if you took out the role of tether of this other currency. So I mean, right now it's really evolving. There's so much to it. It's probably a lot to get into, just even as a sidebar to this conversation. But again, as a general takeaway, what I want to get across is, e-currencies. There's so many different coins that are coming out in the marketplace. And I also want to make a point too that when we talk about Bitcoin, it's encrypted, right? And it's also decentralized from the standpoint, not so much from like we're talking about with the data storage. That's going to be consistent throughout, but decentralized as far as not having one nation state or financial backer, single institution kind of behind that coin. So when you look at some of these other e-currencies coming out from a big picture standpoint, they're not all encrypted. With a lot of these nowadays, it's not anonymous who holds the coin. It's clear, who has that.
On the other hand, some of them are specifically designed to be extra encrypted, like the middle one or the Monero one.
Yeah, exactly. So you're seeing all sorts of different flavors. And you're also seeing trends where some of these coins now are, well, for example, Russia is looking to create a multinational e-currency with a couple of Eastern European states and a couple of countries from South America. To some extent, this might create more efficiencies as far as trade or international commerce between those countries. But you're just seeing this new technology, all these new doors that are being opened, especially from the coin realm, and all the different ways that these can now be put together. And really, again, from that standpoint, I think you got to look at this as the Wild West. It's going to be really, really difficult to predict which doors are going to open, how this is going to shake out, where this is going to go. And I think to be the person sitting here and saying Bitcoin is going to be the currency 5 years from now, I think that's a really tough assessment to make at this point, right? So that's the e-currencies. And again, the big key thing is what we got to understand is it's the blockchain component that made these viable, that essentially gave birth to Bitcoin and all these subsequent coins. And so now that you've kind of got the background as far as how the currency sort of pulled this blockchain technology through, let's take blockchain on its own and really discuss what that is. Ralph, if you don't mind, let's go to the next slide.
Let's pray this works.
Are we leaving the subject of cryptocurrencies?
We are. It may tie
Can I
into
save my
some...
question for later then?
Sure, if you want to jump into it right now, since we're waiting for the slide to pull up.
I just wonder, which cryptocurrencies do you speculate in, and which cryptocurrency authorities or podcasts do you listen to?
Yeah, great question.
Heidi always asks great questions.
And I probably read a lot more than listen to the podcasts. I mean, there's a few that caught my attention, and frankly, I read about it. I go to like CoIntel. That's a site or Cointel that I like quite a bit. And usually there's quite a few links from there, but that's always a pretty great way in. Especially for me, a lot of the focus was really from the real estate standpoint. Being a business owner and you got your bones on the map and I've got investors behind me and what have you, you're constantly having to look and say, what's coming out, how could this impact us? And again, trying to, if it is something that's going to really make a pretty big dent, that I'm able to stay on the good end of that, see where it's going and position myself. So from that standpoint, I read a ton. I probably spend half my day just reading different sources and really anything, whether it's straight up news or history or economics. I'm kind of fascinated by anything and everything, but I'm able to consume so much information about technology and really what always I think where I like to play is where does technology meet culture, where does it meet society, where does it meet business, how does that innovation unfold and affect our day in day out lives. And especially when you've got a vested interest, because you've got a business in a rapidly changing realm. I mean, real estate certainly within 3-4 years could look pretty similar to what it's looking like now. But there's a lot of really interesting innovation at hand where 3-4 years it could be radically different. Yeah. And that's the kind of world that we're living in, especially as it relates back to blockchain. We'll see how that could even have similar unfoldings. But from that standpoint, I really make it my business and certainly piques my interest to know what these are and how it could affect me, and again, making sure that I'm going to position myself on the good end of that.
How many cryptocurrencies do you own?
You know what? I bought Bitcoin late 2015. I sold mid 2016. So.
All right. You made somebody else happy.
Yeah. I would have liked to have stayed in, but we were, and actually this was a lot in conjunction with. I've got a few friends that really play in that space pretty heavily. So there's been a lot of trading. At this point, I'm not a currency trader. To me, I think where the big play is, frankly, would be to be an investor in a blockchain startup. I'd be much, much more interested and feel like I'm on much more safe territory if I'm in that realm versus, again, the currency. I mean, right now I connect with a lot of currency traders. I see people that are making a few $100 per day, losing $250 the next. It's a lot of work. Yeah.
Can you explain how this really relates to your real estate business? Like, are you actually mining? Do you have...
No, I'm not mining. I didn't jump into that. But no, but in fact, that's going to be, if you don't mind holding on to that for just a second, because what I'm going to do is when I'm talking about those current applications of technology, I'm going to talk about that from the real estate perspective. I'm going to show you how there's a current ecosystem that could really be supplanted by what's yet to come. And I think that's going to then dovetail very nicely into some of the broader implications with these technologies.
And you're not forgetting the government.
Of course. Well, and actually it touches directly on government, on role of government. Yeah, so let's jump into the blockchain. So again, the key with blockchain is it's this different way to store data. You typically had the centralized database. That was kind of the heart of software development for so long. And when this Bitcoin first came out, the blockchain technology that stood behind that was a paradigm shift. Right, and you can almost see from the image on the slide, what this distributed network of computers, at least from a concept standpoint, what that may look and feel like. Right, so when it comes to the that distributed notion, what that really means is if you're going to hack and change the data that's held within a blockchain. This data is distributed over this global network of computers. You would need to hack into each and every one of those computers at the same time, the same way, and make the same change, all simultaneously, to have a chance to alter, the records or change the data or hack or take some certain nefarious actions. And when you're talking about going into one database and making that change or having a breach. That's one part. I mean, the standard of accomplishing that, as we've seen over the years, isn't all that high. Right? People are doing, this, and there's been some, really significant hacks that have taken place. Look at the credit reporting agencies. So many, Target. The list just goes on and on and on. I don't need to bore you guys with those details. So now you're talking about a completely different paradigm shift as far as how that data is stored. And it significantly raises that standard of what somebody would have to undertake in order to hack the system or to do something nefarious, right? So that's what's really revolutionary about this technology. Storing data isn't a new concept, right? Whether it's physically or digitally, but it's just the details of exactly how it's done that makes this so revolutionary. So that's really the key. So when we're talking about the decentralized component, that is really what the heart of this is, that decentralization as far as how the data is stored. Does that make sense? Is that starting to at least from a concept standpoint, kind of coming into... Go ahead. Did you have a question, sir?
Actually, I wanted to follow up on what Maris asked earlier concerning security. Aren't hackers getting more intelligent and working on hacking networks? So blockchain, does blockchain prevent the hacking of networks, or is there security elements to it?
Do you have a question?
I was just going to say that there's one thing that I feel like you haven't said that's super critical.
What's that?
Everybody has access to the same database, so everybody has a copy of the records and the books.
Everybody who owns one.
Everybody who owns one has a copy of the ledger at all times.
It's public.
So that's why it's so difficult for anybody to hack. Because not only do you have to hack each one also has a copy of the books and checks and audits everything that happens. So that's what we...
Yep, and that's actually a little bit on the next slide.
I'm sorry.
No, it's all good. It's all good. But one of the things that I did want to mention in relation to this is I wouldn't underestimate hackers at all. You know, I mean, this is a new technology, and what are humans? You know, I mean, we're just hardwired to try to figure out systems, and you know, and over time, I'm sure that there's going to be ways to you know, for security breaches potentially to happen, even with this new technology. I mean, I think what's exciting about this is, again, it just on the face of it, with the way the data is stored, significantly ramps up, you know, the standard that would need to be achieved in order to, you know, create a breach. But that doesn't mean that it would be impossible. Plus, what you're seeing are instances where there's, you know, the hacks that are going on nowadays are probably more of like the human sort of intelligence variety, right? So there was, where was I think in Korea or something, one of the exchanges sent 400 million to the wrong place or something like that. There's a company called Rex MLS, which is a MLS, a multi-list service where you find, you know, and can search for properties within the scope of real estate. Again, you know, a lot of where I touch on this is within real estate. Rex MLS, when they did their ICO, their initial coin offering, it's like an IPO, but, you know, for these blockchain-backed businesses, they sent 140 million to the wrong place. You know, probably what that is when you're keying in that you know, unique code as far as who's supposed to be getting which monies, maybe somebody came in and provided a different code or disrupted the system, you know, at that level. So the security of the blockchain process itself, so far it seems to be, you know, just that, fairly secure. But when you're looking at all the different ways that these things are put together, including how the human touches these technologies, you can see that even there are some areas where breaches could take place. Go ahead.
I was noticing on the dark web that they're selling a program where it'll, when you cut and paste the address from one place to another on the computer, it will substitute the hacker's address instead.
Exactly.
So that's a very easy way to suddenly, for the hacker to get all kinds of digital currency.
So, and I mean, look, you know, in the context of real estate, I mean, it's the same thing that's already happening in almost a physical sense. Like whenever, you know, typically nowadays when you close on a home, ultimately when the purchase, you know, the transaction, you know, is fulfilled, right? There's typically a wire that comes through, right? So you pull in a wire from the buyer that goes into the title company, and that wire then gets sent out to the new homeowner, and that's their money. That's how they get paid for their home, right? We've had a lot of instances now where people are hacking into emails and at the last minute switching out the wiring instructions. And there's been a lot of high profile incidents where somebody just sold their home for, you know, $500K, maybe they got like $250K in equity, and all of a sudden that money, instead of reaching their bank account, went to somebody else's. You know, so in a lot of ways, what you're seeing with the blockchain technology, it's you know, those same types of hacks, you know, present within that system. I mean, that is something that the door is open to. But when you're looking at the technology standpoint, again, the key point is that is much, much more secure. But over time, as these technologies continue to progress, as more and more people spend time thinking about how to hack and how to make a breach, who knows? All bets are off. You know, I never underestimate the human potential as far as, you know, what they're trying to accomplish.
So you see opportunity for scamming too. That's what scares me, because someone can call me up, my husband's not there, to say hang up, and I listen to them, and before you know it, they have all my information. It just, that scares me.
Yeah, or even, you know, you write down your unique passcode and your roommate, you know, or you know, what have you, you know, somehow, you know, takes that information. But again, it's the technology, you know, that we're most focused on right now as far as what that could do. So let me move on to the next slide, if that's okay.
Let's try it. Nope, didn't work.
Is there something inherent in blockchain technology that helps prevent the types of things we just talked about, where people can interrupt and have a wire transfer sent to them instead of to the right person? Is there anything inherent?
I wouldn't say necessarily inherent at that level, because again, that's where the human meets the technology, and I think that can happen anywhere with any technology or even in physical processes. But if you're minding your P's and Q's, and certainly with these high-profile incidents where people did send money to the wrong place, and that seems to be the extent of the hacking, at least as far as I've perceived it so far. Outside of those scenarios. Or with the attention that they got, a lot of people are hardening their processes. So, for example, going back to the title company example, nowadays you can't just email a wiring instructions. You have to either physically bring that piece of paper in or call and voice verify. So some of that type of stuff, and it's funny because it takes us further away from technology, to take advantage of some of these technologies. But so, when it comes to, like ICOs and sending money to wherever, that's probably some of the processes that are getting, hard nowadays as far as, okay, I'm sending it to XYZ, maybe I've got to double check, maybe there's some way that information has to come in where it couldn't be, like a hack via an email or something of that nature. Right, so blockchain visualized. This is actually a image that comes straight from the Wikipedia page for blockchain. I think it's going to kind of give you a good sense of maybe just what that is and how does it come together. So I know it's fairly generic and not a lot of detail, just kind of that image. But if you bear with me for a second, we'll kind of go through that and show how this blockchain really operates in specifics. So when you're looking at this type of framework, right, and this would be more of like almost kind of like think of a smart contract. In fact, let me take this back to the real estate perspective. Who here has recently bought or sold a home, or I'm sure you guys have done that at some point.
You don't look too happy about that.
So when you look at the Colorado the real estate contracts that we typically work with, the heart of it, there's a section called paragraph 3. It's date and deadlines. And I almost look at that as like the table of contents for a real estate transaction. Right? It's going to set forth when the transaction starts, when it finishes, and especially all those key milestones in between. The bulk of which are going to be buyer due diligence, right? Inspection, review of the title history, the legal, the ownership chain of the property, making sure there aren't any, liens, what have you, associated with the property. The appraisal is another part of the buyer due diligence, making sure that the value truly is there. Property insurance, making sure that they're comfortable with the insurance component for that property, all the way up to the final loan approval, making sure that buyer is comfortable with their loan approval terms. So when you look at this sort of process, again, it sets forth when it starts, when it finishes, what are all these milestones, right? That's the process that we walk through nowadays. And when you think about blockchain, it's something that could very easily be replicated by that type of technology. So when you look at this image, what you're seeing is almost a step-by-step framework walking somebody through a process, right? So this green box right here might be when buyer and seller first get under contract, right? Buyer put forth an offer, the seller signed it, now you're officially under contract, you're engaging in this process, and you're beholden to those contract terms, right? So that green box might be this store of data where it says, okay, buyer A met seller B, they've both been verified as to who they are, these are the contract terms, that's been verified as well. All that is now going to be secured. There's with that data mining, that's where that piece comes in place as far as what they call proof of work, verification that all those facets are correct. And once you've gotten to that point with the verification, then it moves you on to the next process, which might be the buyer dropping off the earnest money. Once they've accomplished that, it's been verified, then you're moving forth to the next, to the next, to the next. So in a lot of ways, right now blockchain is very difficult to define. I'm not saying that as a cop-out. Certainly I'm going to kind of get into what I think my definition is. I mean, again, from a very raw standpoint, it's a different way to store data. But even when you're looking at like legislation, for example, I was at a conference a couple months ago, and I think it was the deputy CIO for the state of Colorado, and they're looking to embrace blockchain technologies for for voting, for tax records, for even real estate contracts. But they're being very specific with whatever legislation. They're trying to do a lot of reach out to the community, but they're wanting to make sure that they're not too specifically defining blockchain, because it can mean different things to different people, or there's different aspects that are more weighted, from some people's perspective as opposed to others. And also, as time goes on, some of the nuances of that definition may alter. So they're really being very conscious not to lock into something too specific, just because it's a little bit too fluid at the moment, and especially again with what may be yet to come, to really say this is exactly what it is.
I'm just having trouble visualizing this. So these are storage places, these little
Yep.
blocks. Okay. How do you retrieve a copy of it, say? Where does that come out? Like, you have a verified copy that's legal.
Yeah. So let me jump into what I think my definition is, or at least a framework for understanding, right? So from the previous slide, we talked about how blockchain is that different way to store data across a global network of computers. Essentially, it's a database in some sorts, right? But I think for us to get our arms around a little bit more clearly, the way that I look at it is a way to establish a secure digital process that results in this very secure ledger, this track record of whichever transactions took place within that framework.
And you can access that.
Yeah, and within the different blockchain components, there's going to be different permissions as to who accesses what information they get.
But you have a code of some sort that you use to...
Well, and that's probably getting more into the really
I don't know
specifics.
how this works. I'm sorry.
No. It's and let me just spend a little bit more time here. And then I think that the next step is I'm going to talk about what some of the people are doing within real estate with this framework and how it's being applied. And so I think between this, you still might be a little bit fuzzy, but once I get through that next part, it's like, oh, okay, I'm starting to kind of grasp, what this is and how it could impact us. So, but that's the key point. It's a way to establish a digital process. Right? Like going under contract in real estate and all those milestones. I mean, right now, that's just something we follow along with the contract. This could be replicated online so that when you're on your computer, your user interface, where you're kind of like engaging with the computer, that could be still pretty straightforward. But what's behind it is this very, very secure technology, which is a different way to store the data. But what happens is with each one of these blocks, we'd almost think of it like a physical lockbox or a safe. Right? So we're going under contract. Step one, buyer signed, seller signed. We've got an agreement that's all been verified. Imagine you're putting that into this box, locking it, securing it. It's verified. And now that we've reached that point, now we can go to the next step. And then once we reach that point with that next step, then we go from there to there. And assuming that all this reaches the culmination, you've got a transaction that's been culminated. It's been completed. You may have some orphans. Perhaps there's some back and forth negotiations that don't go any further. But when you're looking at the trunk of this blockchain that is designed to lead you from the start to the finish in that secure manner, where they've created this process, and each one of these is very, very secure and has been verified as far as the data, what happened with that. So if we go back and say, well, you know what, we agreed on inspection terms at this point, and one party says, no, we didn't, you could go back, and there might be different permissions, but you can access that and say, well, no, wait a minute, buyer A and seller B both did approve that. So you can't, it's not this revisionist history or the chance to say, or even worse, somebody breaches the system and changes that record, right? Because this record, this blockchain, just as you were saying, lives within each one of these computers. So if I'm going to make a change and say, oh no, wait, they didn't culminate that transaction, I would have to do that to each computer that's on this global network of these interconnected systems. Go ahead.
In that diagram, starting at the top, the reason it's a chain is because if you change a number on any one of those lockboxes, it will change the number that's in the green box at the bottom.
Yeah.
And that's why it's a chain, is because they're chained together where you make any changes and everything else is corrupted.
Yep. And if there is a breach, some of the systems, the security protocol, they'll shut down the entire, blockchain. They'll say, hey, right now we've got a breach. Something does not compute, maybe on one of these computers, one of those results or one of those pieces of data no longer matches what's congruent with all those other computers, and hence that what flags things and says, wait a minute, something's not right here, stop the presses, we need to verify what's going on. So that's that kind of inherent security with this. So let's actually, before we go to the next slide, I think that's going to frame it just a bit further. Let me talk about how this happens, or what's going on in real estate right now. So I mentioned this, contract that we work on, right? That contract is set forth by the Real Estate Commission, the State Real Estate Commission. In fact, the ecosystem, for any of you that have bought or sold a home since really the modern era of real estate has unfolded post-World War II, you've really operated within this ecosystem. Let me just describe this to you as far as how real estate is done, right? So it's really set forth. There's three key players: the National Association of Realtors, and by their extension, the local boards, in conjunction with the Real Estate Commission in whichever state, and that ties in with the local MLSs. The MLS is really, in a lot of ways, especially as far as residential real estate is concerned, that's like the heart of real estate. Right? That's where all the homes are listed. When you're trying to sell a home, you can put it there. That's where all the buyers go to look. All the agents have access to this. So this is the framework that we've been operating in. So years ago, the National Association of Realtors, which is one of the strongest trade groups out there, strongest lobbying groups out there, they set forth, in conjunction with those state real estate commissions, who gets to be the keeper of these MLSs, this MLS information. And MLS is essentially a monopoly, right? They control all that information. So the National Association, in conjunction with the local realtor boards, set forth that this is the framework within which we operate, right? So they decide who has permission, who can access this information, who can be a real estate professional in the state, what the rules are. They set forth the contracts, the rules. I mean, this is the playing field. This is the ecosystem, within which 80-90% of real estate on the residential side is done. So that's the framework. That's the ecosystem, right? And it's process driven. And what you're starting to see now is there's a lot of players coming out that are saying, wait a minute, that's just one way to do it, but it's not set in stone. That's how you got to buy or sell a home, right? There's different ways that you can put this together. And so a lot of these companies, and some of the big initial players, this company called Proppy, there's another one called ShelterZoom, there's Realisto.io. And what these guys are doing is they're trying to figure out a new way, or a better way from their standpoint, as far as how buyer and seller can meet, how they can, the buyer can find the property and then engage with that seller and get under contract and ultimately lead to the culmination of transaction. And they're using blockchain as a mechanism to accomplish this. And from some of these players, there's some inherent advantages. So like Proppy, for example, intends to be the way that real estate is bought from an international standpoint the world over. In fact, this company is very forward-thinking. They're based out of Australia. I think they initially started in California. I'm not sure why they moved to Australia. But ultimately, what they look at is a lot of these inefficiencies and challenges when you're buying real estate from an international standpoint. Who here's bought real estate in other parts of the world? Okay, it's not always the easiest process. The process from one country to the next varies. There can be corruption, graft, idiosyncrasies with those processes. There's just a lot there that doesn't make this the easiest, most nimble process. Proppy is trying to work with different state players to have this either approved legislatively or from a state standpoint to say, if you're buying international real estate within this country, here is the framework that you're going to utilize for this, right? They're also looking to do this within the states. Even though things are a lot more homogenous here than they are internationally, the way you buy real estate in Pennsylvania compared to Colorado, compared to other states, it's all different. So Proppy, in fact, they just did their first blockchain-based real estate transaction. I think this just happened 2 weeks ago. That was the first blockchain-based real estate transaction here in the United States that was accomplished. And their goal is to essentially have this perhaps become the de facto way that real estate is bought, not just internationally, but here in America. Right, so what are we talking about here with libertarianism? We're talking about less government in people's lives, greater individual freedoms. For years and years and years, since the inception of modern real estate post-World War II, we had one framework that was government-backed, that was essentially a monopoly through the National Association of Realtors, and again, by the extension, the local realtor boards. And that's just been the de facto way that we've been doing it forever. And now all of a sudden this new technology has opened these doors where people are saying, hey, wait a minute, I've got this nimble, efficient building block. I can make a better process or a different process and potentially supplant that ecosystem, that government-backed, monopoly-based ecosystem right now is subject to the potential of innovation within blockchain. Go ahead.
So, the thing that I associate with the MLS are the listings of all the houses. So, so who is going to organize the listings of the houses?
It's and that is going to be an area for change. I mean, the MLS does have the nice benefit that is the place where buyers and sellers can meet. But again, this is a monopoly. Who holds that information? What do they get to do with it? How do they get to monetize it?
So I was saying, who organizes Craigslist? I mean, buyers and sellers meet. Who says? I mean, that's the statist way of looking at things. Oh, there's got to be a central party doing the organization.
Yeah.
The whole point of this is decentralization, and we don't need the central authority.
Yeah, I mean, there are some niceties as far as having one place where the bulk of people, the marketplace. I mean, think of this as like a physical place where you're trying to enact business, and we're all going to the same central location within town or what have you. But now somebody else can claim that ground by having a better system or a different system, or just something that catches on and becomes the new way of doing things. But the bottom line is you've got this efficient building block, the way data is stored and the way that you can build these digital processes where you can say, well, hey, here's how they're doing this stuff. Let me come up with a better mousetrap. And there is a potential that mousetrap really catches fire, catches on, and supplants a lot of these traditional systems and processes.
Maris, the contract end of these transactions, which is normally a cooperation between, for instance, the county clerk and the realtors, is a separate system from the MLS right now, okay? And there's no reason why it can't be a separate system in the future as well, okay? So you would have the blockchain, which would be something like what the title companies do, okay, to guarantee that the transaction has been is a good transaction. And so you've got all these cooperating pieces that can be split out, and each one of those pieces can become in itself a blockchain. Now, the MLS, the multiple listing service, really has, at least in my opinion, very little to do with blockchain technology, because all they're doing is listing the properties, and there's almost no third-party interaction involved, okay? It's when you have two people who want to agree on something that they wish to record as a part of the contract process, that's when the blockchain technology may be an absolutely wonderful thing to have in the future. So, will blockchains, I think the real question is, will blockchain technology supplant or replace what the county clerks do? Okay? And that's an open question. I mean, there's a legal issue, because right now, if you want to transfer your property to Phil, you've got to go through the county clerk. Okay? Will laws change that will make that unnecessary? I don't know. Given the powers of the county clerks and the governments, they're going to say, you want a legal transfer of property? Sorry, you got to go through us. But who knows? Maybe they.
Well, and it may not be that the legal process has changed and opens that door. It may just be that there's a new way of doing things, and almost the tiger, is swung by the tail. All of a sudden people start to participate in a different process, and hence legislation needs to follow suit to address whatever this is.
Blake wants to say something, and then I want to just follow up for 10 seconds.
Sure, and if you don't mind, let's try to get to the next slide.
Oh, God. Let's
You got a
try
question?
that.
While we're waiting for the slide to come up, I'm glad that Ralph brought up about title, okay, and ownership. I used to work in the title business. I changed title, and blockchain to me would do away with the necessity for title insurance, because you can then say, we can see who owned this.
Yeah.
It's a distributed ledger. We can see, everybody can see who owned it and when they owned it.
Yeah, and of
Do away with
course,
the county clerk,
any
do away with
liens,
the
clause on
title
title, would be identified through that and addressed, and there would be that digital history of that. I do think there's still some of those X factor components. I've not had many title issues, but just to speak to what you're talking about, I did have a buyer that bought a home a few years ago, and come to find out the guy that sold the home after the sale was running around claiming he still had ownership and was getting loans with the home being the asset that would back those loans. Come to find out, obviously it came to a head. The guy defaulted on his bills. They said, hey, let's go after the home. And so my buyer that was living in that home all of a sudden got a notice of election in advance saying you're in foreclosure, you haven't been paying your bills, much to his surprise. And we called the title company and they said, wait a minute, this title issue, we'll own this, we'll take care of this, we'll rectify this. So those sorts of scenarios, that might be kind of getting back to the human variation, where blockchain, even with the inherent security increases, you could still have some of that type of stuff. But I think as a result, with the secure digital data, probably title insurance could be a whole lot less expensive, moving forward, and could be a whole lot more efficient. You may not see quite as many title players, maybe just a few bigger firms that are doing a lot of these transactions in volume. But that's a whole another aspect. Okay, so this was the slide that I was mentioning with the Real Estate Commission. And the National Association of Realtors and the MLSs, as far as how that may unfold. Actually, can we go one more slide forward?
If we can. I hope so.
Call on Jesus, Ralph.
So hopefully this kind of pulls it all together with what we're about to say here. in just a second.
Unbelievable. I apologize. It's on my screen, it's just not going there.
More technology.
There we go.
Beginning to learn how to do this.
So hopefully this starts to pull all this together, and then we're going to start to talk about some of the other implications, especially from libertarian values. To me, and a little bit of vanity here, I did quote myself. I apologize, a bit of an ego here, but blockchain is the current processes and protocols as code was to traditional business structures. Right? Think about like back in the day. You had a record store, right? That's how you bought and sold music. You had a brick and mortar. You got the physical, records, CDs, tapes, whatever it might be in the store. You had salespeople, selling that, what have you. And then all of a sudden people realize, wait, we can just do this digitally. We can do it online. And
I get it.
do you remember something like Napster?
Mm-hmm.
It came out, and kid in his dorm room, and actually a couple of kids. One was the tech guy, the other guy had the big picture vision. Said, wait, we can just do this online, and that single-handedly felled or at least significantly impacted, especially the revenue potential of that music industry. Right? So that's just one example, and of course there's just a multitude of others as far as how impactful code was to what was going on before. And now that we've got blockchain, blockchain's code, it's almost like version 2.0 of this sorts of disruption. It's just been organized in a certain way, like with this data storage kind of mindset, that's like this new, more efficient building block of the way to do things, especially when you're creating digital process. So from my standpoint, anything that's process driven, it's transactional, it's got protocols, which is really just about anything within the world of business, government, what have you. These processes, these traditional ways, they can all be redone within a blockchain framework. So that example of like the way that we buy and sell homes and this ecosystem with the the real estate commission, right? This is the process for how we've done this for years and years and years. This is the de facto. And now somebody can come along and say, wait, we've got this new tool, and I can more easily put together a better process, a more secure process than what the current is. And so even though the National Association of Realtors, with all their revenue they're trying to take in, with all their members, with the importance of the MLS, historically, with the role of the state real estate commissions, all this could be supplanted. It could be supplanted by whether it's large businesses. I mean, you're seeing IBM, Microsoft, Amazon. I mean, all the big players are embracing these technologies. So you may see change, innovation, disruption. And by the way, before I go too far, let me just kind of give you my definition of disruption. Traditional definition of disruption is, a established industry that's significantly altered by somebody coming in that's maybe providing a little bit less quality, but a much better cost. Right? And that's one very, very specific way. To me, I think that's too narrow, too specific, especially what we're talking about. When I look at disruption, it's taking any sort of established ecosystem where there's a potential for innovation and technology to fundamentally, at the core level, alter how that ecosystem may work. Right? So I'm talking about that real estate ecosystem, and you're seeing, wait, there's a way that somebody may just, here's a new mousetrap, and all of a sudden that becomes, the new normal, and our lives are ultimately altered as a result. Do you have a question?
There's a controversy within libertarians about granting copyright, and what I just heard you say, and maybe I'm jumping off a cliff here, but blockchain could have prevented Napster from stealing copyrighted material, because when I buy something, it would have a blockchain code attached to it, and I could trace it back to the author. So could blockchain protect authors?
It could,
and
certainly.
musicians?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And look at the process now as far as verification, who has ownership rights to content and things like that. And especially as maybe we're not on quite as much of terra firma with the security of that data. And now you've got, like, if you remember that blockchain image, you've got these little lock boxes where I can put the data in, and it's much more secure. So just like with title, where the type of research and all that typically goes into the process, is pretty extensive. Nowadays that might be simplified because you're able to go back and say, well, hey, look, this is all within the blockchain. This is all verified. It's all right in front of us. I don't have to do all this extra research to make sure it's truly congruent and what have you. So, I mean, and that's just one way. I mean, again, anything that's process driven, whether it's ownership rights of content, whether it's real estate transaction, whether it's how you vote, whether it's how you draw in campaign contributions or political contributions. I mean, all these things, you've got these established frameworks, and somebody says, wait, hold on, I'm just going to put together a new, nimble, more efficient way to do that, or a different way to do that, or a way that I think is better, or a way that other people have control over the system. So what we're seeing is, I think with a lot of technologies, from the user interface standpoint, like how you're engaging with the computer, a lot of that, like what's on the screen in front of you, may still stay somewhat similar, but everything that happens behind it could be radically different. And with those new technologies, again, I mean, that just may mean that all those aspects, what we're doing in our day in, day out lives currently, if these technologies play out the way that they could, it could radically alter those ecosystems, so to speak. Can we move forward to the next slide?
Unbelievable!
Yeah,
All right.
good job.
So let's not get too far. I mean, I do think, and I'll touch upon that in just a minute as far as those further implications where I think, blockchain and what it represents could really, things could be seriously different 2, 3, 5 years from now in a lot of different areas. But before we get too far, just understand there are still some concerns with the limitations with blockchain. Biggest part is just as far as like the currencies and the payments mechanisms, there's a lot of latency, right? Whenever something happens, like let's say it's transactional, I'm gonna buy a piece of gum at the gas station, what have you. If it's an e-currency transaction, this is one of the big limitations right now, there's this latency, right? So when that transaction happens, this needs to get sent out for the proof of work, for these data miners to verify this, make sure that is a true transaction, that, you know, buyer, seller, who they say they are, that, you know, the price was right, you know, that this was the product that was being sold and conveyed. It can sometimes take as much as 5-8 minutes, if not longer, for a blockchain transaction to be verified. So you can imagine what kind of havoc that would, you know, wreak if you're sitting there at the gas station trying to pay for your gas, and you know, there's a line behind you. You got to wait 5-8 minutes for that transaction to go through.
Longer.
So that's
longer.
yeah. So that's a big problem right now, as far as at least the currencies really permeating our day in, day out lives. You know, but in general, that verification process, there's a lot of, you know, there is still latency with it, and people are trying to figure out better ways to have that verification process, that proof of work, take place that doesn't take quite so long, and also that it doesn't require so much processing power. Right? Are you guys familiar with those mining rigs that people build to do these verifications, these proof of work? These are very, very high-powered computers. You know, they can use as much. I've read some statistics. Maybe you can, you know, verify this. But they use as much power in a single day as a lot of households use over the course of a year. You're seeing people establishing these data mining rigs in areas where there's a lot of power bandwidth, like rural areas, like especially out in like Oregon and things like that. So they've got a lot of access to power. The power is cheap, and even then, they're still really taxing those electrical grids, right? So that's the other part. It's just with the nature of how these are built. This proof of work, which is so much of an inherent part of this blockchain process, really takes too much power. And in its current inception, that can be a significant barrier to growth, or to ultimately having this be so widespread, because our electrical grids may not actually be able to support that. There's also storage limitations. So within the blockchain, currently with most of the processes, there's only so much data that each block can hold, and only so much data per transaction on a blockchain. So there's certain things or certain size transactions that may not work quite as well with the blockchain component. And of course, what we're talking about moving forward is, you know, don't underestimate hackers. I mean, you know, having been in motorsports and seeing all the creative and colorful ways that people got around the rules in order to, you know, essentially cheat the system, it really shows you that there's no limit to the creativity of the human mind. And as far as technology is concerned, and even certain things like, imagine quantum computers, right? We're talking about the standard with the way that data is stored across this global network of computers, and you have to hack each computer in the same way at the same moment to, you know, have a chance to make a dent or to achieve those aims, right? So if we've got a system now where quantum computers are so much more powerful, they can easily do this. You know, all of a sudden what we think is this really heightened security concept of the blockchain, all of a sudden that whole notion could be felled with, you know, with a innovation. Go ahead.
If I may add a little bit to what you're saying there, with Bitcoin, you're usually limited to only a few transactions per second, both because of the size of the blocks and of bandwidth and computation. On the other hand, these transactions, there's hundreds of transactions per second, and generally the agreed standard about where you're trying to go with cryptocurrencies is to be able to compete with the credit card transactions.
You have to.
So currently they are working on changing algorithms so that you can be cost competitive, or actually greatly exceed the cost, or greatly improve on the cost of even credit card transactions.
Who is the they?
The they is just the whole cryptocurrency developer community. The people that are designing cryptocurrencies.
And it's not like there's just one blockchain. You know, that's like just this way to create a, you know, process and store information. Everybody that's up to something. Like that Rex MLS company that I mentioned, they had their own blockchain process. Proppy had their own. You know, so it's not like this is just one sort of central place where we're, you know, going into. Everybody's got their own little spin on this, their own little, you know, way of doing it. So it's really whoever's behind that. I mean, a lot of these are people looking to, you know, be the next startup, you know, millionaires or billionaires. You know, college kids that think they got a, you know, better idea and they're going to build some technology. And so when he's saying they, that's an example of the type of person that might be looking to see just that, if there's a way to make these processes, more nimble, more efficient, less expensive. And essentially, I do think that in the world that we live in, it's probably not going to, at least the currency standpoint and the payments framework, we're probably not going to see widespread utilization of these e-currencies until we're at least as quick or close to being as quick as your typical transaction would take. I mean, if there's one thing that we're all aware of, people lack patience, and all of a sudden, just because there's some newfangled way of making a payment, they're not going to be sitting at the register for 3 minutes at a time and twiddling their thumbs. Go ahead, sir.
Two questions. The first one is whether the insurance principle would allow problems to be easily solved, the $200 million that went in the wrong place.
And it wasn't. They don't know where that money went.
Is it an insurable problem, or are all sorts of these problems?
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if over time, I mean, this is like all these new doors are opening. I mean, just imagine like this is, you get a room or somewhere where it's a vacuum, there's no air molecules in it, and you open the door and all of a sudden all this, whatever it is rushes in, and right now we're just at the forefront of all this, and there's, with the way these doors are opening, there's any different ways that this could go, and different ways to attack the ideas, and I'm sure somebody's going to be thinking of an insurance component. I mean, what's interesting is think about the FDIC, well, of course, one of the biggest insurers in the country. When I brought up that title, example where somebody sent the money to the wrong place, guess what? That wasn't a breach within the bank account. They took that in, and before, between bank accounts, that's where the hack happened. FDIC doesn't cover that, so you're seeing even in those traditional areas, there's sometimes, problematic, situations, but certainly with whatever's going on with these emerging technologies, as they become more established, more routine, I'm sure people are going to be starting to think about those ancillary as far as, insurance or financial services or all those different things that might sit upon, those systems as they progress.
Second question is whether, I read recently that pretty soon none of our incomes or our assets will be known thanks to the blockchain. What does that do to our government?
And you're jumping ahead just a little bit, but I think that is a really, really key point to be thinking about here. Yeah, so go ahead, sir.
Do I understand that each block replicates itself up the chain? Is that how that works? So each block has the same information?
Exactly. Okay. And spread out over all those computers. So that's where, if you're just going to hack one computer and say, oh, no, they didn't send money to this guy, they sent it to me.
Right.
And they're going to look at all the other computers on that global network and say, well, no, that's not congruent. Everything else says this, and this says something different. That is a red flag that there's a breach, that there's something amiss here, and that is an inherent part of that security.
So the bigger your chain, the slower the transaction?
Not necessarily. I mean, I think the speed of the transaction is still dependent upon, a lot of that comes down to the code and the way that they've got the verification process set up and what have you. So those are the limitations. Ralph, if you don't mind, let's.
Oh God.
Positive.
So is this starting to kind of sink in? And I know it's kind of squishy and tough to get your arms around this, but hopefully by just talking through it, defining it to some extent, showing you how it's being utilized, hopefully this starts to really give us a sense of what that is. But again, just from a simplicity's sake, to me, well, the currencies, that's just digital money, right? That's one part. But the blockchain, it's a way to build a secure digital process and to really have that very, very secure track record, that ledger of transactions according to the chain, that results. And that's what's so much different about how things have been done prior to that, right? And also, because of the way that that code is now organized and be able to build these systems, it's this more powerful tool than in the hands of, big players like IBM, Amazon, what have you, in the hands of, state players. But also, don't underestimate, somebody in their garage that's got the next big idea. I mean, look at Napster, the first thing that really significantly dented and impacted the music industry. That was just a kid in his dorm room. right? So going back to that slide where I said anything that's transactional, process-driven, you name it. Now somebody's got like a much more efficient tool to say, hey, let me attack that. I think there's a better way to do this or a different way to do this. And some of these traditional ecosystems, traditional ways of doing things could really be altered. You know, and that is what we're on the cusp of. So jumping into that long-term impact, and you mentioned a great point that you know, technology. I think it was as we were before we got into the presentation. Technology has been a democratizing factor. You know, it's leveled the playing field. Yeah, I mean, how else could a kid in his dorm room, you know, completely fell to the music industry? I mean, prior to code or technology or some different way of doing that, you know, you got to get a loan. You got to, you know, from the bank or something like that. You got to set up your brick and mortar. You got to, you know, there's all these traditional ways. It was really with that technology that all of a sudden somebody that you know, wasn't going to get a bank loan or wasn't going to set up a brick and mortar would have the means to, you know, fundamentally alter and radically, you know, change what's being done. So one of the big things is, as I'm saying, you know, it's similar to code. It's equally powerful in the hands of corporations, state players, individuals. And I think there's a real momentum here as far as people attacking the blockchain. I mean, part of it is, again, there's you know, from businesses that are spending millions, if not billions, you know, in data security. And all of a sudden Microsoft or somebody's coming to them and saying, look, here's how you store your data in typical, you know, Oracle database or what have you. We can work with you and reestablish that with this more secure process, right? So, you know, just think of the cost savings as far as you're stepping onto this. So you're seeing state players, you're seeing, you know, health information services. I mean, across the board, people are looking at that and saying, is this a solution for us, especially in the face of you know, security component, which has been such a huge driver, and of course, such a huge, you know, budgetary aspect. So you're seeing that permeation. But the other factor is, you know, there's a lot of people there that are ambitious, that are saying, I mean, just within the real estate space, I've been doing classes, presentations about real estate and blockchain and Bitcoin, and I'm not just getting real estate professionals going to these classes. You know, I'm getting technologists that are saying, hey, I think we can do something in the real estate space. I don't know much about it, but let me attend some of these classes and you know, see what's what. There's guys coming out with a coin, or instead of being backed by just the security of the blockchain, or like Tether, where it's, you know, tied into the U.S. dollar, but a coin that's you know, backed by the real estate market at large. Right? That's a very, very innovative way to think about things. There's people that are saying, hey, here's your typical buy-sell process. I think I can do a better job with it. Oh, by the way, if I do a better job with it, I can make a lot of money. I can be the next, you know, blockchain millionaire or billionaire. So just like code gave, you know, ambitious kids or people, what have you, the chance to really make something big happen, now you've got like code version 2.0, a more efficient, you know, way to build a process based on how these blockchain tools are organized. And you're going to see a lot of people that are just saying, I want to make a dent in the universe. I want to do something big. Let me utilize this tool to change this aspect of you know, our lives, our society. Let me use this to address banking or you know, whatever it is. Go ahead, Ross.
I need you to stop for 30 seconds.